Hi, good afternoon. For folks who are just joining, we're going to get started with today's edition of Arizona Community Grand Rounds. Thanks very much for joining. We'll get started in just a sec as people are connecting up from their various meetings and other activities. While we're waiting for folks to join, I'd encourage those who are connected now that if you have ideas and suggestions, recommendations for future topics or presenters, we would love to hear your suggestions. You can send them directly to me, Mark Carroll, at mark.carroll@healthchoiceaz.com, or to Mary Jo Gregory. We can chat that information in, or you can actually send us that information through the website, where all the recordings of previous sessions and presentations are posted. And we really value that input and your ideas moving forward. So please don't hesitate about sharing ideas. We've had some terrific presenters over the past year, and we're really looking forward to more terrific presenters moving forward, especially today's presenter.
And Mark, may I just add, while we're waiting for folks to join, that this is the first one that we're able to offer the CME credits for, and that should be the information on how to apply for that is all on the invitation. But we can certainly help you with that if you don't see that and you want to do a CME credit or CEU credit.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Jo, and thanks to the NARBHA Institute for working on having those credits available. So Becky, you're paving new ground for us today. Well, I think we will get started. I know people will join, but as I mentioned, these sessions are recorded. Welcome, thanks for joining today's version of the August edition of Arizona Community Grand Rounds. I'm Mark Carroll with Health Choice Arizona, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Arizona. Really pleased to co-host these sessions with Mary Jo Gregory, President and CEO of the NARBHA Institute, and very appreciative of the NARBHA Institute for their leadership in forming and supporting these sessions. The sessions are recorded. CME and CEUs are available for today's session. Please follow the guidance when you receive your information about getting those credits, and let us know if you have any problems with them. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the chat or the Q&A during the course of the presentation today. Based on how things are going, we will not interrupt, but gently introduce some of those questions into the flow as Becky is presenting today. And certainly we leave opportunity for dialogue and Q&A at the end of every session. So today we're very fortunate to have Becky Ruffner join us and present on a presentation entitled Early Childhood Trauma and the Juvenile Court, an Arizona Story. Becky is an Arizona native, third generation of an Arizona pioneer family. And so she has been working really, I would say, throughout your life, but certainly throughout your adult career to advance the well-being of children in the state. Becky now she's the founder and the executive director for Prevent Child Abuse Arizona, but she also has a range of other types of programs and initiatives that she has co-founded, developed, and that have been going on for quite a number of years. And I would take probably a lot of our time to summarize some of those, but it's very impressive, and it demonstrates a commitment which has really been lifelong, and we want to honor, Becky, that you've made to children and families in Arizona. It's quite impressive. So the one thing I will note that I found very interesting about your CV that is more personal is that Becky is a fly fisher woman, fly fisher person, and I have always aspired to learn how to do that. I do it poorly, so maybe Becky, you can offer me a lesson at some point moving forward. So without further ado, I'll turn the platform over to today's presenter, Becky Ruffner. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you, Mark. One of the great things about fishing is where fish live. That's why I do it. I'm delighted to be here with you today, and I thank Jennifer for our technical assistance, Mary Jo and Mark. I really appreciate this opportunity. This is a story I love to share. And it is one that we know now after almost a little over 20 years of working with juvenile courts and communities throughout the state, is making a real difference in particularly the lives of the youngest children in our juvenile justice or juvenile court system. I had an opportunity early on, or right after the new millennium began, to work again with a colleague of mine who'd moved away to DC and had come back with some really interesting experiences of working with child psychologists and juvenile court judges together to try to figure out what they could do jointly to change the practices that they were implementing and improve outcomes for very, very young children. And that's what this story is. It really revolves around my dear friend who has since passed away, but she brought this knowledge back to our state, and we'll go from there. Next slide. I think we skipped one. No, maybe we didn't. You're right. Okay, we're good. So soon after we began working together, we really started taking a look at the data about who are children in foster care in Arizona. And we were really astounded at the overrepresentation of very, very young children in the foster care system. And what that means is that these children had, number one, been reported to the child welfare system. Then their cases had been investigated, substantiated, and a decision was made to remove them from the physical custody and care of their families. And we learned that a really high percentage of children were not only under 5 years of age, but the majority of that group were under the age of 3. Next slide. So further investigation showed that 4 out of 5 of newborns removed from their parents' care in Arizona are substance exposed. Newborns are almost universally screened now for substance exposure. And most hospitals, although not all, most hospitals are very diligent in reporting substance exposed newborns to the child welfare system. Infants and toddlers, we know those children who are later in that first year, 2 years of age, 3 years of age, were very likely to be rather severely developmentally delayed. These are children who've had very chaotic early lives, and they simply weren't progressing at with the developmental milestones of their more fortunate peers. And then after removal, of course, we knew that children often experience very definite emotional signs of emotional disturbance. Sleep disturbances, aggression, depression, feeding problems are rather common. And these are serious symptoms that the trauma that these children have experienced, coupled with an abrupt change in caregiver, was really affecting them at a very deep level at a time in their lives when they're most vulnerable to stress. We were aware that without effective services, these children are at risk of future behavioral health disorders. And this information is well documented now in child welfare literature, and can be seen most poignantly in our juvenile corrections system, most of those youth, if not almost all, share early trauma in their childhood, which leads later to a number of conduct disorders and difficulty staying out of jail. Next slide. So adverse childhood experiences have been fairly well recognized, I think, throughout the medical community and certainly in child welfare now for some 20 years. And this is based on a landmark study that was done of a large population of middle-class Americans in a HMO. And what was really the bottom line result on this study that went on for a number of years was that 5 of 10 adverse childhood experiences that were documented in this population were forms of child abuse and neglect. Other issues that young children had experienced that were documented through this study involved having a mentally ill family member, having a incarcerated relative or family member, having experienced in one's home domestic violence of either mother or father. And then substance abuse was another very corrosive factor, and just divorce and dissolution of the family unit when children were very young. So these things tended to clump together, it was found. And next slide. So the research of Vincent Felletti in San Diego actually started with an obesity study. And he was working with the Kaiser Permanente HMO to try to develop a obesity clinical approach to help people lose weight. And they were remarkably successful in the first year or two of the program. Many of the participants in the program lost tremendous amounts of weight through changes in diet and lifestyle, of course. But what became very relevant is that within a couple of years, the vast majority of these individuals had gained that weight back. And Dr. Felletti was very interested in this failure. He was really stunned by it. And he began to look more closely at the histories of these people and conduct a series of very in-depth, delicately, of course, but a very in-depth interviews of these individuals. And through the study, he and then Rob Anda got involved with the Centers for Disease Control. They were able to confirm the direct link between the number of adverse childhood experiences in early childhood and chronic health conditions throughout life, the most expensive health conditions we know of, and even early death. These people were less likely to live an average lifespan, and these underlying conditions and underlying early childhood experiences could be highly correlated with these outcomes. Next, and as you can see on that slide, Arizona has a fairly high percentage of adults with 3+ adverse childhood experiences themselves. So I think the national average is more like 20-21% of adults in the population of our states, whereas Arizona has about 1 in 3. Next slide. So what Dr. Felletti talks about is how he began to become aware of how surprisingly common in the lives of middle-class Americans extreme childhood adversity, in fact, was. And obviously he began to be able to measure through his statistical work with Rob and the CDC that exposure to one type of adversity increased the probability very strongly of having experienced other types. Bad luck tends to run together, and families who are struggling with any one of these issues oftentimes have a myriad of problems that really erode their parenting capacity, their capacity to keep their children safe and healthy. And he was also struck with the fact that over a century later, most of his study participants, well, the average age, I believe, was 57, retold in vivid detail their childhood horrors. They could recount when certain types of abuse started or when daddy went to jail, and the soliloquy of multiple traumas that followed during their childhoods. And he was very surprised once he worked through his interview tool about how willing people were to talk about this. And oftentimes he'd hear the comment, nobody's ever asked me that before. So people seemed sort of relieved in a way, and were willing to share this information. And they also disclosed very regularly that they felt their current health problems, obesity, drug addiction, domestic violence, sexually transmitted diseases, sexual promiscuity as an adult, were directly related to their early childhood trauma, because it really served a protective function for them, particularly individuals who were obese. And I remember one case that he videotaped and shows in his trainings often, of a woman who talked about when the sexual abuse in her childhood began. She began feeling very withdrawn from kids at school, but she would eat and eat and eat in order to somehow kill the pain inside of her, until she gained enough weight that she felt she would no longer be attractive to her molester. And so this is the dynamic deeply rooted in what we know now, the amygdala, the emotional memory storage in our brain, how these very, very dramatic early experiences were related to adult health. Next slide. So the group that I was working with here in Yavapai County got together really at the suggestion of my friend who'd returned from DC and had done quite a bit of work with the organization called 0 to 3. And they had started a series of conversations between juvenile court judges and child psychologists and psychiatrists around early trauma and how the known damages and insults to the well-being of young children that they were seeing could be how we could more effectively intervene with that. Neuroscience, as you recall, I'm sure, really boomed over the last 20 years. And in a decade or so, the technology was available in the 90s to look into the brain itself and see how the different areas of the brain were affected by experience. So it seems like a simple concept, but it is really a powerful one, in that early childhood brain development is fueled by a series of serve and return interactions with caregivers. When those interactions are safe, stable, and nurturing, we thrive as young children. we thrive and we reach our potential intellectually, and we can function emotionally, and later on we can function well socially. When those serve and return relationships are either absent or troubled, we see children who come into the child welfare system really very behind in their development and their capacity for emotional regulation. Next slide. We know that the human brain is a use-dependent organism. We're all at our age, I'm sure panel members would agree, trying to use those parts of our brain that may be a little rusty at times so that they stay well tuned, and our executive functions and memories are still thriving. But the human brain, especially in the first 1,000 days of life, is exquisitely sensitive to stress. And in fact, I heard a child psychologist say one time, babies have emotional radar. They are far more sensitive to the emotions of the individuals in their immediate environment than adults are. And we know that maltreatment of young children actually derails the architecture of the brain, the way the brain is building connections between the billions of synapses that we're born with through those serve and return relationships. Also, scary experiences such as abuse and neglect cause a flooding of the brain of those proteins and chemicals like cortisol, which bring on a fight or flight reaction. And that reaction not only occurs in our brain, it occurs throughout our body, throughout our central nervous system and our sympathetic nervous system. And when children experience those children have those experiences over and over, the synapses that should be forming in the other parts of their brain are really delayed and in many cases thwarted. So we know that the first 1,000 days is the most important time of life to get children off to a good start, so that those social determinants of health do not become so glaringly obvious in adolescence, in midlife, and as we age. Next slide. So we began actually in the lunchroom of Prevent Child Abuse, monthly meetings, just a small group of us. And we wanted to get together to talk about our group of children, young children in Yavapai County Juvenile Court, and what we could do to improve outcomes for those babies and toddlers. And everyone was invited. We met over a lunch hour, brown bag lunch at first, and we invited foster parents. We learned, interestingly, very early on that when foster parents receive a new child in their home from the Department of Child Safety, within the first 30 days, 6 or 7 different people, health department, developmental services, on and on, visit the foster home. They didn't know each other's roles. And for the most part, foster parents weren't quite sure why they were there. So it seemed that the role of foster parents is so fundamental. They really are the intervention for young children who can't be with their families, that foster parents should be better served by knowing exactly what these folks needed to know, and how they could work together to share information and assure that these kids were on the road to some stability. So within a year, we were able to develop what we call the Essential Services Checklist for young dependent children. And we took it across the street to our court to Judge, now Chief Justice Brutinel, then Juvenile Court Judge Brutinel. And we showed him this essential services checklist. We told him that it was our recommendation that he consider having more frequent hearings for the young children in his court. And we suggested a number of other things that we felt might be very useful in changing the trajectory of these children's lives. And he was very interested and very willing to work with us. And so he was the first judge who said yes. Next slide. Gradually, I guess judges talk to each other. We were invited more and more frequently to each county by the judicial officer, the juvenile court judge presiding. And we worked all over the state over the next 4, 5, 6 years. We brought people together initially, the judges and their community teams. We began bringing them together annually. And just this last month, we had our, 21st, I think, statewide Best for Babies meeting, where the teams all get together and talk about the ways in which they've been able to make changes in their system and how those things are working, share resources, and then set annual goals for continuing to make improvements in the outcomes of their child welfare cases for young kids. Next slide. We had a lot of help initially and really throughout our effort from 0 to 3. And their approach, it's all the same approach, by the way. Best for Babies, Safe Babies court teams. It's all the same. We have to reinvent our reality, I guess, depending on our geographic location. But Safe Babies court teams approach is framed on these 12 core components. The most important and the initially the most important is that the judge is willing to take a look at increasing judicial oversight of cases involving young children. We had I was providing training to a juvenile court judge one time, and she said, "I'll never look at a young child the same. We would hold a preliminary protective hearing and say, see you in 6 months. And now you're saying we need to be looking at these cases every month." And that has happened in most of our jurisdictions. More frequent hearings, a community team that meets every month to guide the changes in the system and train other stakeholders coming into the system. Really an authentic connection with foster parents and especially birth parents. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we see the data from Maricopa. Much more frequent visitation. We highly recommend daily visitation for infants and toddlers because of their developing memories. And we weren't able to achieve that in most cases, but we have seen increased visitation across the board. And then building an infant mental health services system so that the people in our behavioral health system and our child welfare system are understanding and have a greater capacity for implementing infant mental health practices, thinking about what is best for babies. And then a couple of multi-state research studies were showing that we could see through this approach reduced time to permanency, the length of time a child is in out-of-home care, and increased rates of successful reunification. So that was our goal from day one, is trying to help birth parents while we were also supporting the healthy development of their children to get to reunification. Next slide. So we're really, we have put in place a statewide systems change initiative, and we've seen some really stunning results. We have used all along evidence-based practices in coming from neuroscience, clinical child development, and trauma-informed care, and also really focusing on birth parents who are involved in the child welfare system, and the fact that, not surprisingly, the vast majority of birth parents in the system also had traumatic experiences in childhood. And those very well may be factors which impede their parental capacities. So we've found some ways to approach that, which are very promising. And then the local team of stakeholders, I think our Yavapai team is now in its, I think, 22nd year. Tomorrow there's another Yavapai Best for Babies meeting on social determinants of health. So they're meeting monthly and really doing a fine job of guiding the system and working with our juvenile court judge. Next slide. I see that we're a little over time, and we're quite close to wrapping up here so we can take some questions. So really what we do in this approach is we harness what the national program calls the muscle of the juvenile court to focus everyone on the emotional and physical well-being of maltreated infants and toddlers. We used to hear when we started this work, babies are resilient, they don't remember. We know that's not true. We provided training throughout the state and very intensively in Maricopa County. We've also trained a lot of court-appointed special advocates who we call baby CASAs. And that work continues through a grant from the Nina Pulliam Trust. And we just had one of those trainings yesterday. Next slide. So our goals are to increase the shared knowledge of every single person who's involved in each baby's case, so that there is common understanding of the unique needs of these young children. And then to use trauma-informed care to improve child welfare outcomes. Next slide. So in Maricopa, I'm going to tell a little bit more story here. We hadn't been able to get any really much interest in Maricopa until about 2011. And in March of 2011, the newly appointed Maricopa Juvenile Court Judge Ed Ballinger called me one day and said he was still in St. John's adjudicating Arizona's ongoing water disputes, but he was about to join the Maricopa Juvenile Court as a presiding juvenile court judge, and he'd heard about this Best for Babies thing. So I was able to meet with Judge Ballinger, his court administrator, and his data person briefly, and I suggested rather modestly that he might look at having this approach and putting this approach in place for perhaps 10% of the 700 and so young children who come into his court each year. And I gave him a raft of research and all sorts of policy advisories from the ABA. And he took that material, and the next Monday, I got a call from his court administrator saying that he did his homework over the weekend, and he had decided that he was going to appoint 6 baby judges to handle the caseload, and they were only going to be hearing cases of young children, and that they were going to begin implementing the systems changes that we had recommended, including engaging birth parents and foster parents in the courtroom through dialogue from the bench. That had not happened before. Judges tend to talk to attorneys in the courtroom, and they weren't necessarily engaging the caregivers of these kids, the foster parents, and the birth parents. So those were just some initial changes that made some big differences. Next slide. So the program began in Maricopa and with some very comprehensive behavioral health assessments of young children, which we had some leverage there in bringing the birth to 5 assessment into behavioral health practice. And we trained about 4,000 people over that 3-year period. So it was a lot of driving and a lot of presenting all over the county to all the community stakeholders. Next slide. Then the Maricopa Board of Supervisors became very interested in what was happening in the juvenile court, thanks to Judge Ballinger, and began funding the program so that services could be funded through the county, which were not currently available. And he was able to get the use of a former youth treatment facility, which was empty, but under the domain of Sheriff Joe at the time. So there was a bit of a tussle there, but ultimately the Board of Supervisors turned the youth treatment facility over to the Cradle to Crayons Child Welfare Center program, which subsequently opened its doors. And soon after that, Maricopa County made permanent $2 million in annual funding for the Cradle to Crayons program because the data showed reductions in court costs because of much more rapid closing of cases and return of children to their birth parents. Next slide. This just describes what services are most highly correlated with the outcomes that we were seeing. So the services that were put together at C2C were services that could be seen by those child welfare experts and clinicians to be needed. And those included resource coordination, which is simply a matter of meeting with birth parents at the C2C right after the first hearing and talking to them about whether or not they are safe at home, if they have a place to live, if they have transportation, if they have food. And those are stabilizing services that we find so many parents needing at that time. Clinical assessment, trauma therapy for both birth parents and child-parent psychotherapy, family time visitation, and then reunification support after baby goes home, so that that transition is supported with some clinical services. So most highly correlated in the reunification rates increasing were the resource coordination and trauma therapy and the resource coordination and the family time visitation. Next slide. And those are the outcomes that were published in the 2018 ASU Center for Child Wellbeing evaluation. We have another report coming out any day now, and we have seen I believe it was reported to me recently, a 72% successful reunification rate with C2C families, up from what was the average of about 30% reunification rate. Then it grew over the first couple of years to 64, and we're now up to 72% successful reunification. So next slide. I think that's it. Yes.
Well, Becky, thanks so much for the overview of such impressive work that you've led and that you and colleagues from Yavapai County, Maricopa County, and around the state have just been so instrumental in. We've got some great time for some conversation. So I invite participants to please feel free to chat in comments and questions through the chat function or the Q&A. But Becky, I'm curious if you might just share a little bit about how the conversation has changed over the past years of this work in terms of the receptivity to the dialogue. Chat a little bit more, if you don't mind, just about the tone and the ease of the conversation.
Yes, Mark. It was, you really put your finger on a key aspect of this, because as you imagine, the child welfare system is not extremely open to change. It is a system driven by crisis and usually chronically underfunded. And the juvenile court is not perhaps the most flexible shop in town. So initially, there was resistance on almost all parties. We had to put together a steering committee of agency heads so that they felt included, and we began to introduce this approach and bring in experts. But I think the biggest change, frankly, was in the behavioral health system. And I'll give you a quick example. One day we were visiting, we asked for a meeting with the public health department, behavioral health services. At that time, our behavioral health system was under DHS, you remember. And the attorney general for the department was there, and I'll just say that the behavioral health provider for Maricopa County leadership was there. And they were not thrilled about the changes that we were asking for infants and toddlers coming into the child welfare system on the part of their system. The meeting was contentious. It was not at all pleasant. We walked out of DHS that afternoon. The attorney general for the department turned to me and she said, I just reviewed a petition for an 18-month-old child who witnessed the homicide of her mother. And the report from the behavioral health assessment was no behavioral health need indicated. That has changed 180 degrees. In Coconino, you have a wonderful group of people, your court team there, and they're implementing many of these same approaches. The behavioral health system, Mercy Care, is working with us here in Yavapai, and we've asked them for big changes in the way their behavioral health referral and services work from the very beginning of the case. And they're working with us. So I think from where we were then, say 2011, 2012, to where we are now a decade later, Arizona has a very vibrant infant mental health capacity now. And the behavioral health system is recognizing what happens early stays with us all.
That's so important. Thanks. And conversations that start around hard topics where our knowledge base grows together,
Yes.
are always challenging, but they're so important to creating that critical foundation of insight, language, and shared goals and purpose. Would you agree?
And relationship building. Once we were able to start, and we were able to build relationships and build communication with different stakeholders, then trust developed, and we could point the way to, nobody wanted bad outcomes from their practices. And, you know, Tom's quote, Tom Batchelor's presentation recently, Grand Rounds, he used the quote, every system functions exactly as it was designed to function. Well, we were messing with the design, and we still are.
Yes, but kudos and giant applause to you, colleagues, court systems, and everyone working together to continue to work on that redesign in the midst of just very busy day-to-day needs and challenges. We do have a question, if you might have any perspective on recommendations for currently obese adults who do have a history of adverse childhood experiences. You had given the example early on. Any insight or perspective on that?
Well, you know, I would cite the conversations that I've heard and had with Dr. Felletti. What he showed is that the healthcare utilization of the individuals in the obesity clinic, once he began utilizing this structured interview and talking to them about what, not in these words, but what purpose their condition served in their lives and how that came to be. Once he started those conversations, emergency room utilization, crisis calls, a number of healthcare utilization data points came down for those individuals. And often people said, no one has ever asked me before. Thank you. I feel like I've let a splinter out. So I think it's connecting on a deep emotional level to a place where most people really aren't comfortable going in a casual clinical setting. And he's worked with physicians throughout the country since, just tirelessly, to get them to talk about not only are you safe at home, but what their early childhood experiences were like, because it's so highly correlated to their current health and the dollars going into the system to maintain people that have chronic disease, which is preventable.
Yeah, thank you. That sharing of story, which is sometimes so locked inside so many of us and so many of the folks that we work to help and support, being able to release that story is in a safe, supported way is certainly part of therapy. It's complex, isn't it? And trying to understand how to help folks, but recognize that people's journeys and the journeys of their parents, from what we know from epigenetics, are very important too.
Indeed.
There's a comment, if I may read one from Cody, who noted working in juvenile corrections and also worked in early childhood development, and 95% or so of young folks are victims before perpetrators. What Cody has noticed is that many of youth suffer from delays due to early substance use, and traumatic brain injury has resulted in developmental delays. That their goal is to continue to develop a more therapeutic environment, incorporating trauma-informed care. Thanks for the work. Any reflection, Becky? But boy, that sure seems completely consistent with what you mentioned.
Well, it certainly does, and we know that kids growing up in abject environments really have fewer learning opportunities for those neurons to hook up. So those developmental delays, the most profound is usually language and reading, particularly reading, but the just spoken communication is the foundation of healthy relationships. And it just ties together so clearly in the developing brain, and then in the lives of youth who basically don't have impulse control, don't have that self-regulatory capacity, because the back part of their brain was overused when they were little, so the front part of their brain hasn't matured. And that's so true. One thing Dr. Felletti shared, I remember, is that one of the participants in the study was a prison guard who was obese and joined the program to lose weight. And after he lost the weight, he gained it back again. And through the interviews, he told Dr. Felletti, I feel more powerful when I look like a brick wall. He was a prison guard. So that you could see the function of that health condition, which was going to cost him in his life, but it was protected.
We are such combinations of mind, body, spirit in our histories, are we not? And I think respecting and honoring that's so important. Thanks, Cindy Martin. Just noted a comment of how instrumental that you and colleagues have been in changes in Maricopa and Yavapai counties. Where's the work go from here? And is it going with other counties? And you mentioned Coconino, and also how outcomes are measured. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, we do have court-appointed special advocates, judges, behavioral health people, public health people, making up those local teams. And I think at our July annual meeting of Best for Babies, every single county was represented. The teams could get together and they could participate on Zoom as a team, or they could be in their own remote locations. But every single county had a judicial officer, which was leading the systems changes. And one of the problems we have, Mark, in our system, in our juvenile court system, is that our data systems aren't good. They're very, very old and very inefficient in terms of being able to tell us much. But that was one of the things that the Arizona State University Center for Child Wellbeing was able to break through, which was they got, for their 2 big evaluations here, the second is ongoing and soon to be published. But this first one, they were able to get the child welfare system data and the juvenile court data for their study. First time those permissions have ever been granted for research. So with that data, they were able to show the changes, the increases and the improvements in the marker outcomes that we were looking at. Things like placement stability. Did a young child have to be moved to another family and another family, or was the first placement last placement? Timeliness of services, the services offered to parents, and the engagement with birth parents, so that they really felt like the folks were there to help. So those are some of the metrics that are being measured on an ongoing basis of the Maricopa study. And I'll just say that I know that Coconino is starting a visit coaching program with their birth parents and young children. If it's not already started, I think it's starting soon. And then also Yavapai has just started basically replicating what Maricopa did, which was pull all the services together into one place. So birth parents go immediately what's called B, number 4, BY, baby is the acronym. And there is initial clinical assessment of the parents. There is assurance that the current location and family for the child is good. Pediatric care is in place, immunizations updated, all the just very basic things on that checklist have been really pulled together through our local team. And our West Yavapai Guidance Clinic just gotten a new name, and I can't remember what it is, but they are really leading this up, and Mercy Care has been tremendous in their flexibility of working with us to implement. And we hope to start evaluation in probably, I'd say, 1 to 2 years.
Are there good online resources where folks can go to learn more? I'm sure there are, as well as any upcoming meetings or conferences folks should have on their radar.
Yes, for sure. I would highly recommend the Harvard Center for the Developing Child videos on YouTube. These are the best experts in the country talking about babies' brains and how we can do a better job of meeting their immediate needs. Those are excellent resources. Also, the 0 to 3 program, their Safe Babies Court Teams. If you just Google that, 0 to 3 Safe Babies Court Teams, you will find just a whole plethora. All the research studies are all there. Their annual conference is coming up. I'm sure it's right there on their website. It is virtual, so you don't have to go to DC this year. And then really, if people are interested at local level, getting in touch with their juvenile court and finding out when their court team meets and joining that group. Those are the things I'd recommend.
Great, thank you. Yes, and thank you to the folks in the juvenile system, as well as the judicial and legal and court system who are participating today, and even folks, of course, who aren't, just for the the committed creativity and collaborative spirits that have led to these outcomes. Lots of work still ahead of us, right, Becky? But a strong foundation, and we need that coming out of the pandemic. Hopefully coming out of the pandemic, but do we not?
Yes, hopefully coming out. Yes, and every child who's substantiated for child abuse and neglect and removed and placed in foster care is a new start. And it's another opportunity to change the trajectory of that child's life because we know how.
Boy, that's such a nice concluding statement. Thank you so much. Mary Jo, any concluding comments for today? Thank you. You're on mute, Mary Jo. Sorry. There you go.
So many times we do this, we still forget the button. No, just thank you very much, Becky and Mark, for your interaction, all the participants for your time. I think this is such a vividly important topic, and the work is in the weeds as well as on the research level, but we couldn't think of anything more important to put our time, effort, and thoughts with than this kind of work. So we look forward to continuing to follow the work you're doing, Becky, and all of your colleagues, and hope also that through this research, you'll come back and we can continue the conversation.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Mary Jo. I'd be delighted, and it's been great working with you, and I enjoy this opportunity to talk about all this, and I really thank NARBHA Institute.
Yes, and with that, thanks, Becky, again, for your fantastic leadership and commitment to children and families in Arizona. It's obviously made a huge difference, and we all honor and acknowledge that. And thank you to everyone for joining today. Thanks for the work that you all do every day as well in your professional lives and in your personal lives. Please take care of yourselves. Look for announcements of upcoming sessions of Arizona Community Grand Rounds in the next few months. And stay well and continue to spread and share kindness. Thanks.
Thank you.